So, I want to pose a question. There's the question, does it really exist? I want to, first of all, raise many doubts in your minds. I want to get you to the position where you really doubt that it exists. Then, so that you don't get too worried, at the end I'm going to accede to the fact, I'm going to concede that it does exist. In fact, I'm going to finish by telling you in one single sentence exactly what information is. So if you came in today not knowing it, when you leave, I guarantee you will have a one-sentence answer. What is information? And you are the first people ever to see this definition. This is a world exclusive. I'm going to answer the big Q question, the big I question, what is information? Okay. So, whatever it is, there's an awful lot of it about. There's a couple of people at University of California, Berkeley, Pieter and Halvarian. Halvarian was, and maybe still is, the Dean of the School of Information and Library Science, whatever they call it there. And in 2000, they did this study of how much information was in the world, and then they updated it in 2003. And if you go onto the website, I think if you just type in how much information on Google, you will get to this page. There's a picture of the two guys with Varian on the right. And if you look in that page, you'll find all kinds of facts and figures about information. And here are just some of them, just to indicate the fact that there's a lot of the stuff about. We may not know what it is, and you don't know what it is yet because I haven't told you, but there's a lot of it about. Actually, 3 or 4 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and the first time in my life I went into the Library of Congress, which actually occupies several buildings. It's big. Well, you would need 37,000 of those libraries to hold in print form all of the information that was produced, new information, in 2002. It had actually, as you look there, doubled in a 3-year period, finishing in 2002. There's lots of it actually in the World Wide Web. You'd need 17 times the Library of Congress, or you would have done 2 years ago, to capture that in print. Massive amounts of it generated by instant messaging, most of it by my 2 daughters, but that's another story. And email, and I actually lost 7 hours of my life yesterday responding to the email that had come in while I was talking to Pieter and other people here in Amsterdam. So there's a lot of this stuff about. Okay. So let's ask ourselves, what is it? Well, as soon as you start to think about it, information, you try to drill down and really understand what it is. It's like the Cheshire Cat. When you try to look at the Cheshire Cat, it disappears, and you're just left with a grin. And that grin is the information. So that's what we have to try and get a handle of. What is this Cheshire Cat's grin that is left when we try to look at information? Well, let's play a game. Let's play a game. There's all sorts of games around about can you spot in an image. And it's interesting that Pieter and I didn't collude on our talks, but he had the picture of Neptune. I had one of these puzzles. Now, apparently there were 9 faces. This is on the face of it. This is just 2 guys in the United States West on a horseback going through a terrain with a stream and some rocks and some trees. But if you start to look at it, you will find what are alleged to be 9 faces in there. So things can be there even though you can't necessarily see them. Or maybe they're not there. Maybe they're just artifacts. Neptune was clearly an artifact, just happened. This, of course, was designed in by a human being. But it's sort of there and it's not there. When my 2 daughters were very young, one of their favourite books was a thing called But Where is the Green Parrot? And on every page there was a little story, and on every page you had to identify the green parrot. Every story on a page said, but where is the green parrot? And I read that story for about 6 years of my life. So it brings shivers, actually 2 kinds of shivers when I think about it now. Then there's the Great Waldo search, there's kind of searches for words in things. So you're probably all familiar with these things. So let's play a new version of the game. Let's play Spot the Information. Okay, well, here's a guy dispensing it. So presumably, now you know if you go to a shop and it says coconuts, you will see coconuts on the table. If it says apples, there will be apples or whatever. So presumably on the table, there is information. Well, I actually don't see it, but neither do you, but this guy is giving it away maybe. And maybe that's what he has to do, because to me it doesn't look as though there's anything there. Well, here, of course, the reason we can't see it is it's obviously inside the pumpkin. Right? However, if you went inside the pumpkin, what you'd probably find are some people. So maybe is information people or what? Well, let's go on with this game. Here's a classic example of information, right? If you're at a railway station, what do? You say you look up at the departure table and it gives you the information about the departure. That's a funny way of describing it, because that suggests that information sort of flows from that screen into your mind. It doesn't really, does it? Light rays flow to your mind and they impinge upon the retina, and your brain reconfigures itself instantaneously, and based on that reconfiguration, you decide you need to run to platform 4 to get on a train. And you describe that. If someone said, why did you run there? You might say, you probably would say, that board gave me the information about the departures. Well, that's an odd way of describing it, isn't it? Because what happened was light flowed to your mind, the retina sort of activated, the brain reconfigured, various neurons fired, and off you shot. That's maybe a little bit more complicated, but that surely is a bit more truthful. You've been a little bit untruthful if you say you've got the information, haven't you? Well, we'll see. You may say that newspapers provide you with information. Now, if there's one thing you can say about newspapers, it's that they, perhaps above anything else, are responsible for the fact that we now have the concept of information we do. And I'll come to that in a moment. But for the moment, let me say, I don't see any information now. I see a piece of paper with some ink on it. And light rays go from that ink pattern, and we get the same complicated story about the brain, the neurons firing, and on the basis of that, my brain states change, and I feel different from the way I did a moment ago. In the United States, I usually feel pessimistic when I read the newspaper, more pessimistic than I did the day before, at least for the last 5 years. Libraries are supposed to contain information. We have departments of library and information science, so presumably libraries do contain information. And you might say that, in which case I would say, no, they don't. They contain books. Let's be honest about it. What libraries contain the books. So then you would say, but the books contain the information. And I say, no, they don't. The books have words on pieces of paper. Be honest about this. There's no information there. These are words. Okay? You may say these two people here, and let me start playing with the old laser light. You may say these two people are exchanging information. And I would say, they're talking. They're conversing. Why make it complicated? They're talking with each other. 300 years ago, people wouldn't have said they're exchanging information. 200 years ago, they wouldn't have said that. Describing this, which has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, describing that as exchanging information is something we do today, but people for most of our history as human species didn't do. They would have said they're talking. Okay? We may say, or you may say, that this lady is imparting information. I would say she's giving a speech. You may say that these people are receiving information. I would say they're listening to a speech. You may say various things about these people, that they're involved in information, they're using information technologies, there's information transfer, information coming in over the airwaves, imparting information in a classroom, broadcasting information. You may say all of those things, you probably would. And so will I when I get down from the stage afterwards. But for the moment, I'm going to say, he's broadcasting. They are doing they're performing various interactions with other people, maybe through a computer. They're looking at things on the screen, they're doing all kinds of things. But it's a little bit spurious in some respects to call it dealing with information. He's teaching, he's uttering words, they're looking at the board. Their brains are firing, well, he hopes they are, and they're learning things. Okay, that's interesting enough. You probably wouldn't describe that as an informational exchange. You would say the person is at a bank teller machine and they're drawing out money or they're paying in money. So you're going to be honest about that one. You're probably dishonest about this and this, but you're going to be honest about that. You're probably honest about that one. You probably say she's talking on a mobile phone. So we're not always dishonest. Sometimes we really do sort of describe what's been going on. But other times we have this talk about information. You know, I mean, where is the information? I mean, arguably the information is actually inside that guy's body, but there's a sensor on his wrist and that's been led into this circuitry and there's stuff been displayed there. And so we would tend to say that the information is there. But if there is information at all, it's presumably in there. What comes out of here? Information or sound waves. Is there information on there? Looks pretty boring if that's information. There's not very much of it, surely. That just looks like a piece of sort of coated plastic to me. I'm sure it's got some interesting patterns on it, some bit patterns, but well, that makes it a moderately interesting physical object. But do we really want to call it information? Do we want to call that as a display of information? Not even clear to me where the information is there. Presumably it comes out of those bits that are sticking up and it finds its way miraculously to the computer that's sitting over there. But that's a very strange way of thinking about it. That looks like a guy talking on a television screen. But we may want to say, you may want to say, that information is flowing out of that screen and impinging on your eyeballs. You may want to say that information is coming in from outer space and somehow been focused in on this guy here and finding its way into somebody else's computer. So we've got all these different things, these different artifacts, these different activities that we typically talk about in terms of this single object information, this single stuff, of which there's a lot of it about. Well, if it does exist, it's pretty complicated and interesting stuff, because it seems it can be represented in heads, in sound waves, on electrical screens, in radio waves, on people talking on television, on little bits of plastic, on computer screens, on circuitry. It seems that this stuff manifests itself in all sorts of ways. You know, and one can get a little bit suspicious that if something manifests itself in all kinds of different ways, and maybe it doesn't really exist. Maybe it's an artifact of our very active imaginations. Maybe we see information in the world because of who and what we are, rather than who and what the world is. Okay, so why do we have all this talk about information? As I mentioned, it's very recent. Your grandparents didn't talk about information, certainly not the way we did. And for many of us, our parents didn't talk about it the same way either. Okay. When did it start? And then exactly what it is. What is it? Okay. Well, the word information, at least the English word information, came into being in around the 14th century. And then, as Pieter alluded to in his talk, it was very much a way of talking about being an informed person, being a learned person. It was virtually synonymous with being learned, with informed. So it was a way of describing a person. If you read Jane Austen, for example, Jane Austen is a famous novelist in large part because her novels are regarded as good social commentaries on life at the time. And she makes use of the word information quite often in her books to talk about people being well informed and educated. In Jane Austen, a man of information was someone that any good young woman would want to marry, because that's what Jane Austen's books were largely about. In the mid-19th century, that changed. And it largely changed because of newspapers and various other things. So you think about it, newspapers have a very rigid structure. It doesn't matter whether the article is about sports, politics, art, life, death, birth, marriages, whatever it's about. If it's in a newspaper, it looks the same, it has about the same dimensions, it comes in chunks, morsels, pieces of a certain size. You get used to the fact there's a day's worth of information. Sports information, political information. The content is beginning to become irrelevant. The form is beginning to take over. The rise of these kinds of particularly the newspapers, but also dictionaries, reference books, that began to impose a structure on something that had never been before. And once that structure had been created, people began to think of the thing that the structure was creating. Information Information then had substance. There was amounts of it. You could have more of it, less of it. It could be glossy information, high quality. It could be on cheap paper, probably cheap information. So there was a value beginning to come in. It had a stamp of authority. The Times of London, the New York Times and so forth. There was a stamp of authority on information. We began to, at least our ancestors began to assume that information was true because it came in these pieces. There was a high priesthood in society. There were several high priesthoods that produced this information for us, and we took it from us. And so suddenly we have a concept of information emerging. Separate from the human mind. This is a very different notion. It was no longer being in the mind, it was actually out there in the world. What was going on then? This was a huge shift. Here, information was the result. Here, the word information became applied to the cause. This was the new cause of that. And when that happened, instead of referring to the result as information, people began to refer to the cause as information. That's happened before. These days we talk about mystery novels, horror movies. But mystery is what happens to you when you see that, when you read that novel. Horror is what happens to you when you see the movie. Yet we ascribe the adjective that really applies to the person to the cause. And that's what happened with information. And when that happened, information moved out of here and it moved out into the world. Interesting shift. That was really when information as a concept separate from the mind arose. Mid-19th century. Very, very recent. Whoops, wrong one. Try that one. Okay. Then in the mid-20th century, it changed again. And instead of being this stuff that was produced by a high priesthood and had a stamp of authority and was in a sense the truth, it became detached from the truth. It became in a sense detached from the medium that was transmitting it. Because we had this plethora of different communication, different information technologies, different media coming along, the notion of what was being conveyed changed to a high level of abstraction, if you like. Didn't have to be true, didn't have to be false, it could be processed. Someone in the 19th century wouldn't have known what you meant if you said processing information. Information was conveyed, it was transmitted, it was told, it was presented in newspapers, but it wasn't processed. It wasn't something that could be processed, but now it is. Now it's a different concept. That was, in part, that was created by the work of Shannon that Pieter referred to, but in particular it was created by the development of the more modern technologies. We're really into the 50s, 60s and 70s. If you look at the literature, newspapers, magazine articles, it wasn't really until the 60s and 70s and even later that the information became talked about in this kind of a fashion. This was in 1994. This kind of a sentence, we can read that now and we think, well, duh, of course. But even 100 years ago, no one would have written a sentence like that. That would have made no sense 100 years ago. It just wasn't the kind of sentence you'd read. So when we talk about information today, the information of the information society, information technology, information processing, we're talking about the technologies we have are not processing something that was already there. Our information technologies are processing something that they created. This is something that's a part. So when we use information, and now I'm beginning to loop back on my original questions, where's the information? When we talk in terms of information, we are talking in terms of our world using a framework that is very much a product of our world. It reflects who and what we are and the way we live today. Okay, but those technologies are not doing something with, they're not dealing with a material that was already there, they're dealing with their own creation. Okay, now let's look at why is it a good idea? Why do we find it really hard not talking in terms of giving information? Well, when we don't have technology mediating, you can talk about them as exchanging information, but that would be a very particular use. You'd usually describe this as shaking hands, greeting each other, talking with each other, saying goodbye, whatever, gossiping, it could be all sorts of things. However, If you separate them and you put a piece of Ethernet cable between them, then I would say the natural way to describe what's going on there, or at least a natural way, is to say something is flowing between them. Now you could say electricity is flowing between them. And that's okay, if that's what a physicist might say. An electrical engineer would say electrical signals are flowing between them. But most of us would say information is flowing between us. Because we're now in the technologies for which that kind of talk is appropriate. On the other hand, it doesn't need to be totally modern information. Let's just look back a little bit to that earlier example of the newspaper. You have a reporter writing a newspaper and then eventually that newspaper being read. Now, of course, what's going on here is human beings interacting with human beings. This is a human interaction. Humans have been interacting with each other for hundreds of thousands of years. Right? I mean, before we were humans. You can go back millions of years before we were Homo sapiens, our ancestors interacted with each other. The new thing is we can now, with our technologies, interact across space and across time. You read the newspaper in a different location a day or so later. And when you do that, it makes sense to talk about this one producing something, this thing storing what was produced, and the receiver acquiring it. It makes sense. When you've got new technologies, it's very often appropriate to talk about them in the appropriate terminology. So why do we feel we need it? Why don't we talk about these things in old-fashioned terms? Why do we need this newfangled notion of information? Well, what's going on here is some physical activity and some mental activity. A newspaper is produced, it's transported, and it's read. This is pretty darn complicated. We've got neurons, this guy's head, there are neurons firing in the head. He's speaking on the phone, electrical signals have been transmitted to his fingers, the fingers are moving on the keyboard, physical activity, so thoughts in the mind are turning into physical activity, which is turning into mechanical activity. There's a lot of stuff that goes on here that's not shown on the picture. Eventually those thoughts have distilled their way somehow into print, which is on a truck, which has been delivered across town, or it's on an airplane delivered across the country. And then this person, there's light waves coming off there, going into the mind, there's neurons. At the beginning, we've got neurons firing in a mind. At the end, we've got neurons firing in another mind, and an incredibly complicated story between them. Trying to trace that path and say what is transmitted is unbelievably complicated. I mean, it's unbelievable. It involves knowledge of human physiology, muscles, mechanical typewriter keyboards, typesetting. I mean, you just think of all the steps that are involved. It's an incredibly complicated story to say how that idea gives rise to another idea there. That is a very, very complicated story to tell. Wouldn't it be simpler if, just as we have this hanging out of the top of this person's head, and we have this hanging out of the top of that person's head, why don't we have something hanging on the top of that so that there's a straight connection between there? Instead of having these bubbles coming up out of every step, because to tell the story truly, there'd be all sorts of things in here with bubbles coming out of them. Why don't we put in the middle something that we can talk about as being the stuff in the middle that corresponds to the idea and the idea? Why don't we, in fact, say that a newspaper carries information? The thought and the idea get captured as information, which is carried by the newspaper and acquired by the... That's a much simpler story. It's in terms of conveying something, putting something on a truck and taking it off. Instead of talking about complicated transmissions, let's just imagine there's this hypothetical truck, we load information on it, and we take it off at the other end. Suddenly the world is simpler again. A world of our making that began to be very complicated is suddenly simple. Let me give you another analogy. If you're wrestling, or if you're playing tennis, when you're wrestling, the typical way to describe that is in terms of people exerting forces on each other. That's what's going on. If you're describing a tennis match, the natural way to describe it is of a ball being batted back and forth. That's a little bit strange, isn't it? Because The ball is just an innate object. It's not playing a game at all. It's just there. All of this, both games are about people exerting forces. This is an interaction between people. In a sense, the ball is a trivial thing between them. The game is won or lost and enjoyed by the forces exerted by the two people. Once that racket has hit the ball does what it has to do according to Newtonian mechanics. Right? This is not a quantum ball, it is a real ball. It goes across there. Okay? So all of the action, all of the fun, all of the stuff that makes a difference is in the people. This is just an interaction. The difference, however, is that this is a mediated interaction. We've got a ball going back and forth. And when you have mediation, it's often a good idea to talk in terms of the thing that does the mediating. So, when I'm sitting at home in Palo Alto, reading a newspaper about a launch of a rocket to Mars in Florida, using all of that complicated technology that produces newspapers, I can get information, and now I'm going to use the word, I can get information about that by reading the newspaper, because that newspaper gives me information about that. It does so for a very complicated story. If someone says, how does it happen? That's a very complicated story about the causality from there to there. First of all, a person was involved, the person who wrote the newspaper article. But then it gives me information, not only because I can read English, because the newspaper is written in English, but also it gives me information because I know the newspaper has a stamp of authority, echoes of the 19th century notion. This notion is not antithetical to the 19th century notion, it sort of goes beyond it. I believe the story in the newspaper because I'm used to believing some things in newspapers. I usually believe science stories, sports reports in newspapers. We tend to be less sceptical about other things. Okay. The simple story is to say the newspaper gives me information about the rocket launch. What really happens is a very complicated story that few of us, if any, could understand every step of it. In other words, it really does make sense to talk about information when communication is mediated across space and time. That's why we've got the notion. That's why it's almost impossible to avoid using that term. We live in a society where people communicate big time. All the time. It's the always-on society. There's all of these sort of buzz phrases. When you communicate big time, it's really good to have this convenient little idea about something being transmitted between us. The things that have really been transmitted is very, very complicated stories. Usually the transmission of information is a multimedia story with many, many steps. Goes through several digital stages and so forth before it comes out the other end. But thinking of it as one commodity makes it very simple. So when Google says their goal is to make all the world's information available to the population, that's not what they're doing. What Google is doing, Google is the biggest matchmaking service in the world. Google provides you with pointers. It puts you in touch indirectly with a person. The person who produced that web page or that group of people at the other end. What you want to do when you want information is what you really wanted and what you would have had to do a few hundred years ago. You would have had to find, you'd have had to travel to the person who knew the answer. Now, because of technology, you can go into Google and Google will matchmake for you. It will put you in touch with that person indirectly through this mediated network. And so Google is not an information provider, really. It's a matchmaking service. It only works because people produce this stuff that we find valuable. In fact, it only works well because the Google algorithm, which is it's a product of Stanford's great research tradition, the Google algorithm actually taps in onto human expertise. Google works well because it uses human expertise and it somehow captures it. Okay, I'm going to finish with the answer to the question, what is information? I said I'll give you the answer, I'm going to give it to you. Okay, it would be tempting to steal an idea from Marshall McLuhan, because Marshall McLuhan had very smart things to say about media. And it would be tempting to sort of take his famous "the medium is the message," which actually doesn't mean what I'm taking it to mean here, but let's leave that to one side. So I'm going to deliberately misunderstand what this says, and I'm going to say one thing you could say is when there's a medium, you get information. Okay. But you know, that's stealing from McLuhan. Right? I don't want to really ride on his coattails. I'd like to leave you today going away thinking of not what did Devlin steal from Marshall McLuhan. You know, if you really want to make an impact these days, you need a slogan. So here, to end the talk, is my slogan. Here, for the first time ever, is the answer, the scientific truth about what is information. Information is the tennis ball of communication. Now you know. Thank you.
Keith, thank you very much. I would like to give the public also the opportunity to have 2 questions, although the first question I would like to eliminate myself. You are not allowed to ask, what is a tennis ball? But any other question is welcome. John.
Well, this seems terribly muddled to me. In particular, when those 2 people were talking in that picture, if they were exchanging telephone numbers truthfully, then they were exchanging information. If each of them was lying about his telephone number, then they were not exchanging information. And they weren't just talking.
Well, but remember, what we're now doing is we're using 20th century terminology to talk about something that people would have done over many thousands of years. 200 years ago, that's not the way that would be described. So I would agree that in fact, that's how I would talk about it too. But then again, we all live in the late 20th, early 21st century, and so we are using terminology that's actually almost unavoidable in many circumstances. In using the internet, in looking at newspapers and so forth, talking about information is almost unavoidable. And I think what's happening is it's so unavoidable in many areas that even in areas where historically we would never have thought of describing it that way, now we do. So I'm not disagreeing that that's what we do, but I'm saying the reason we're doing it is because we have terminology that's essential to deal with many of the complexities of the modern world, and it's so essential and we become so fluid at doing it, we've got so used to doing it, that we apply it without reflection and naturally and meaningfully and helpfully in domains where actually, historically, that was never necessary. So I think that's a reflection of the modern world, that we think about in conversation that way.
Well, what did people think they were doing? What did Benjamin Franklin think he was doing when he established the post office?
He was establishing a technology which I think he thought was, you know, the chances are almost certainly that when you invent a new technology, what you think you're doing is inventing something to do better what was done before. And so, when you got the post office, it was trying to do better than the Pony Express or whatever you have before it. But as soon as you invent a new technology, it immediately generates a whole new world that takes over. You know, computers were invented to compute ballistic tables and so forth and to do numerical computations. Now most people use them for getting information. Originally when the automobile was developed, it was called the horseless carriage. But then the whole, it wasn't that, it was a whole different world. So these new technologies, they're introduced typically to do something that we already have and to do it better or more efficiently. And initially we use the terminology of the old, but then the new thing takes over. There's a huge shift in the way we live. It develops its own terminology, and then without thinking we take that new terminology and we apply it to the things that we were already doing, like talking about a conversation in terms of an exchange of information. That's a case of backwards technology transfer, if you like. It's feeding back onto a familiar in terms of the new.
Okay, the debate will be after the fourth speaker. One more question? If there's yes?
Yeah.
There's so much information, why is it so uninformative? Will you repeat the question?
The question was, if there's so much information, why am I being so uninformative? Well, first of all, I've given you a very important bit.
No, why is it so?
Why is it so uninformative? I thought you said
Keith, could you repeat for the whole audience the question once more, then we know what you're answering.
If there's so much information, why is it so uninformative? And in fact, if you think about it, it's actually going to get less so. Because In the 19th century, the channel of information was validated. The only people that could produce these things were the newspapers, the book publishers. So if you trusted the New York Times, if you felt they were honest, you would tend to believe what you read in the New York Times. In the world of Google, of blogging, where everyone can put stuff up, simply it looking good is no longer a guarantee of truth. 100 years ago, if it looked like the New York Times, it was the New York Times and you could believe it. Now you can go to a web page that looks very well designed, it looks very clever, it looks very fancy. And so all of the old ideas we had that gave us to rely on information are no longer valid. So if anything, what's happening now because of technologies, we've actually looped back to the time where, in days of old, before these technologies, before the 19th century in the newspapers, if someone told me something, whether I believed it depended on whether I trusted that person. Then institutions developed that regulated that, so I didn't need to know that person automatically. I could believe it. If you got out of your automobile in a strange city, you turn on a car radio, and you listen to the sports report, and it says the Yankees have won tonight. You don't know what the station is. You don't know who wrote that report. You don't know who the broadcaster is. But by golly, you believe it. Because of its form. If it's a radio sports report, that alone tells us it's true. But now at the stage, because radio stations to stay in business had to do that. They would lie about the politics, because that's their business, but they would tell you the truth about the sports. Newspapers tell you the truth about what matters to you, so they can lie about what matters to them. And that was the way this was corrupted. However, that was fine for a while. But in the new world, except for things like the established newspapers and publishers, you go on the web where there's this gigabytes of information. It really is divorced from the truth. It's just stuff that's out there. You're not going to believe it unless you know the authenticating source. Now that's taken us back before information was ever there. We are now back in the 13th and 14th century where the only answer to the question, can I believe this information, is who did it come from? That's why when you use Google, you usually look up at the URL and you say, is this coming from a department of maths at Stanford or whatever, or is this coming from someone at CompuServe.com? It makes a big difference to whether you're likely to believe it.
Thank you very much, and I would like to state again that we postpone other questions to the debate afterwards, and I think now that you have also given us a view on the new Wikipedias, we would like to look where the information comes from. Thank you very much for this overview.